This video is a short how-to guide in terms of writing and developing your thesis statement and topic sentences. Obviously, there are other aspects that you could be including when thinking about your thesis and topic sentences, and you can touch base with your teacher in order to clarify some of those questions that you might have, or if you want to go further beyond what's presented in this video. So in terms of what we will cover in this particular video, we will look at what's required in an introduction, and I'll take you through step by step in terms of what you should put in each of your sentences, how to actually develop a thesis and what a thesis is, and then looking at also your topic sentences for each of your paragraphs. And I'll put together a peel paragraph structure later on. So a topic sentence would start out that peel paragraph. So thinking about how your topic sentences will set your tone for your argument. When you receive your essay question, there are a few things that you should start thinking about before you actually put pen to paper and put together your thesis statement or your introduction. So the first thing that you should do is look closely at the question and consider how what actually is that question asking of you? What is it that is trying to demonstrate in terms of your learning? So how is it that you can present what you've learned in the unit of work within this question? You should identify any keywords and consider some of those verbs that are associated with essay questions, like analyze, discuss, compare. What is it that this essay question or question is directly asking you to do? You should form an opinion in relation to the question. Do you agree with the statement? Do you disagree? Do you agree in somewhat agree or somewhat disagree? So how exactly are you going to frame your position for this particular question? Consider what aspects from the text are most appropriate and relevant to your response. So thinking about the text that you've selected, how in fact aspects of that text really demonstrate the question that you've been asked. So for example, if you know that there's a metaphor in the poem, but it doesn't necessarily address the question that you've been asked, it would be best to think about some other examples of evidence within the poem or whatever text it is that you're looking at. Think about and then think more explicitly about those examples and start gathering your quotes and gathering your techniques in order to address that question. Once you've gathered some of this information, you would start to develop a thesis statement in response to the question. And we'll go through how, in fact, to do that process shortly. So within your introduction, these are the sorts of things that you should consider putting into your introduction. So the first two bullet points there are interchangeable. So you might start with a general comment about the nature of the question or perhaps the unit of work. So that might be in relation to the rubric or the statement of inquiry. So how, in fact, have you understood the nature of that rubric or the nature of that statement of inquiry? You could then go on to introduce your thesis. So your thesis is your position and you directly addressing that question. Now, as I said, those two bullet points are interchangeable. So you could, in fact, start with your thesis and then demonstrate how that thesis relates to the unit of work or the statement of inquiry. So those two bullet points are interchangeable. Within your introduction, you should also include a full title of the text as well as the author and perhaps the text type. So, for example, you might write something like Maya Angelou's powerful poem, Phenomenal Woman, for example. So thinking about how you would include the full author's name within the text. Once you have stated the full text title as well as the composer's name, once you've done that in your introduction, you can then, in subsequent paragraphs as you go on throughout your essay, you can then refer to your composer by their surname. You might even also put abbreviations for your text title if that's a particularly long title. So in your introduction, you would just have the full statement of the text title and then in brackets the abbreviation that you would like to include, and then you can include that abbreviation throughout the rest of your essay. You should mention how the text is relevant in terms of the response of your question. So how, in fact, do those texts relate to the question that you've been provided? You would then provide an overview or the main argument that you wish to present within your essay. So it's kind of like a roadmap for your reader or your marker so that they can get a gist of what in fact you are going to argue throughout your essay. And obviously those examples that you refer to there should relate directly to your question and obviously directly to your thesis. So an introduction in terms of why it's important because it's your first impression that you give to your marker. It gives direction to your response and it enables you to form a strong thesis which you are then able to sustain throughout. It introduces the texts and also links those texts directly to your thesis. So in fact, your introduction to your essay is really important. So it is really important that you get each of those steps right. And looking at each of those steps, now this structure is a very simple structure, but it makes sure that you are able to tick off all of the things that you need to do within your introduction. So your first sentence should direct your response to the question and develop a thesis. So your thesis may be 1 to 2 sentences. It probably wouldn't be any more. Now, in terms of developing a really strong thesis, articulate thesis, some people might suggest rewording the question, and that's fine in terms of developing a starting point. A reworded question will probably be a C-range thesis statement. In order to develop a stronger thesis, I'd be looking to try and add layers to it. So how, in fact, are you going to interpret that particular question in order to utilize the text that you've discussed? So trying to add a little bit of your own point of view in relation to that question, giving it a little bit of direction. So your second sentence will then mold your thesis and give it some direction. So it might give you a sentence to actually unpack that thesis. What is it that you mean by the thesis that you've presented? Sentence 3 should introduce your text and composer. And then finally, you should elaborate on how the composer's text relates to the established thesis. So how is it that that text is a perfect example for you or perfect proof for you to argue your thesis? You could then go on to give some examples that you would be presenting in your argument. Now, each of these sentences that I've outlined here may be more than one sentence. So you might be able to, as long as you're doing all of those steps in an order like that, it's okay to write more than one sentence for each of those steps. So looking at your thesis statement, a good thesis statement will tell the marker how you have interpreted the question. It will give direction and focus to your overall essay, and it will be sustained throughout your argument. So a strong thesis will be just as strong in the beginning of your essay and sustained all the way through to the end of your essay. That's another marker of a B or an A response, in that it maintains its strength throughout your response. In order to test the strength of your thesis, this is a little checklist that you can go through to make sure that it is a strong thesis. So does it answer the question? Does your thesis statement provide a particular viewpoint or argument? So you should try and avoid general statements. Is your thesis specific enough? Does it put forward a strong argument? Does it pass the so what test? So is it relevant to to your reader? Is it something that they are going to be wanting to find out in relation to the text that you've selected? And does your essay support your thesis specifically? So am I going, or are you going off on tangents? So trying to make sure that your essay is really directed and focused, and your thesis statement is something that keeps your essay on track. So it doesn't allow you to go off on tangents with your text, because if your examples from your text aren't related to your thesis, you're not going to be able to link them back. So really thinking about how each piece of evidence that you provide links directly to your thesis statement. Finally, I just wanted to talk about the difference between topic sentences and thesis statements. Now, obviously, your topic sentence is the first sentence for each of your body paragraphs. So you might have a number of these within your essay. Now, your thesis statement is your overall, kind of your umbrella of your argument within your essay, whereas your topic sentence is molded specifically for each of your paragraphs. So this is particularly important for questions where you might be asked, to what extent do you agree? And for one particular text or one example within the text, you might really strongly agree. But another example of the text, you're not agreeing so much. So your topic sentence allows you to demonstrate when your thesis statement is really evident, or perhaps in some cases, it might be this instance. So your topic sentence allows you to give direction to your thesis. And I'll give you an example of that. So that might mean, for example, if you've got a thesis statement around the female experience presented through poetry and how that's presented in a really powerful way. So if that's your thesis statement, perhaps your topic sentences might be more related to the female experience in particular. So you might be talking about the female experience of motherhood, or perhaps you might be talking about the female experience in terms of the relation of their representation through the media, or whatever it might be. So your topic sentence would give your paragraph direction. So if you're going to do a topic sentence on female experience of motherhood, you would know then that the pure paragraph that follows will be specific about the female experience in relation to motherhood. One of the more difficult things to get your head around in terms of topic sentences, or more in fact, thesis statements, is that your thesis or your essay, in fact, is not necessarily about your texts. Often questions will give you a very broad overview statement, which you need to develop a thesis in relation to, and then use your text to prove this statement. So trying to avoid using your text titles or your composers' names within your topic sentences and thesis are really important, because in essence, going back to my example about the essay on the female experience, your essay is about the female experience and the power of expressing that female experience. And you're just using, for example, Maya Angelou's poem Phenomenal Woman to prove that. So your proof or your text is secondary to your thesis. So you should always try to keep your thesis really directed on your essay question, and then using your text to prove that. So you may, in some cases, have your text titles in your topic sentences, but you wouldn't, for example, within your thesis statement. So that sort of, I hope, sheds some light on some of the differences between topic sentences and thesis statements.